When you think about the ultimate high-stakes workplace environment, your mind probably jumps to a bustling emergency room, or maybe like the chaotic trading floor of a major stock exchange.
Right, yeah, where people are frantically shouting, papers are flying everywhere.
Exactly. You picture this intense, visible chaos, and if someone makes a mistake in those environments, the consequences are immediate and severe.
Absolutely.
But there's a crucial caveat to those jobs. At the end of your shift, you can walk out the door, you can get in your car, go home, vent to your family, maybe grab a drink, and just completely decompress. You have a physical and psychological exit strategy.
And that physical separation is, well, it's entirely what makes high-stress terrestrial jobs survivable. There's a literal boundary between the pressure cooker of the workplace and the rest of your life. Your environment resets.
But I want you to imagine a workplace where that reset just does not exist. A workplace roughly the size of a walk-in closet.
A very cramped closet at that.
Right. It's a tiny, incredibly fragile metal box surrounded by an infinite deadly vacuum. You can't leave, you can't crack a window for some fresh air, and your coworkers are the only two human beings within 250,000 miles.
Yeah, we are, of course, talking about the command module of Apollo 11.
It is the absolute terrifying definition of a captive audience.
It really is. I mean, you're living inside a pressure cooker that has been stripped of any pressure release valve, hurtling through a medium that wants to kill you instantly.
And relying on millions of parts built by the lowest bidder.
Exactly, which is a terrifying thought in itself.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today we have an incredibly ambitious mission. We're going to unpack a comprehensive source text detailing the Apollo 11 mission, and if you're listening to this, you likely already know the broad strokes.
Sure, we've all seen the grainy television footage of the landing.
We know the famous quotes by heart, and we're well aware of the ticker tape parades, but we are absolutely not going to focus on the standard historical highlight reel today.
No, because while the monumental historical milestones are obviously important, focusing solely on the success, often, it overshadows the incredibly complex, friction-filled human machinery that actually made those milestones possible.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the reality of working in a tiny metal box on the way to the moon is far more complex and, frankly, much more relatable to your own workplace dynamics than the history books usually make it seem.
It's basically the most extreme office politics imaginable.
Today, we are looking strictly at the intense human elements, like how did the unforgiving ticking clock of the space race dictate the mission's timeline? What did their training actually look like when they had to learn skills that didn't even exist yet?
Right, they were basically making it up as they went along.
And most surprisingly, what was the daily working relationship really like between Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins?
Because the reality of what it took to put those three specific individuals in that specific spacecraft is vastly more nuanced and, well, dramatic than the pristine, heroic narrative we're usually sold.
Sure.
To truly understand the interpersonal dynamics inside that incredibly cramped module, you first have to understand the immense external pressure crushing down on it from the outside. And that pressure was the geopolitical stopwatch of the Cold War.
I want to dive deep into that stopwatch. We cannot decouple Apollo 11 from the geopolitical terror of the era. The timeline for this entire enterprise didn't originate in a sterile scientific vacuum, right? It was born out of profound existential national panic.
That's the critical context here. If we rewind to the late 1950s, the United States and the Soviet Union are locked in this intense, escalating ideological and military rivalry. It's a battle for global supremacy.
The ultimate staring contest.
Exactly. Then on October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union launches Sputnik 1, which is the world's first artificial satellite.
And the American public mind just completely shatters. But I think, we often misinterpret why Sputnik was so terrifying. It wasn't just that the Soviets had a beeping metal ball in space, right? It was the delivery mechanism.
Precisely. Sputnik itself was merely a scientific payload, but it was a massive demonstration of applied power. It proved undeniably that the Soviet Union possessed the technological capability, specifically the massive rocket boosters required for orbital insertion, to potentially deliver nuclear weapons over intercontinental distances.
Which changes everything.
It completely obliterated the American sense of technological and military invulnerability. The sky was no longer a protective barrier. It was the high ground, and the adversary had just claimed it.
It's that sudden, visceral realization that the space directly above your home is now occupied by your greatest rival. So the United States scrambles to respond, creating NASA and initiating Project Mercury to get a human being into orbit.
But the Soviets simply won't yield the lead. In April 1961, Yuri Gagarin becomes the first human in space, completing a full orbit of the Earth.
And that orbital distinction is really vital, isn't it?
It was a staggering leap in aerospace engineering. The United States manages a response almost exactly a month later, in May 1961, when they send Alan Shepard into space. But the source material makes a crucial distinction regarding the scale of these two events.
Right, because they weren't exactly equal achievements.
Not at all. Shepard's flight was suborbital. It lasted a mere 15 minutes. He was effectively launched straight up and fell straight back down. He didn't achieve the velocity required to actually orbit the planet.
So we have a situation where the Soviets are running complete, sustained laps around the track, and the United States has barely managed to jog to the end of their own driveway.
That is exactly the vast capability gap that existed. And this was the stark reality facing President John F. Kennedy when he took office. He looks at the geopolitical chessboard and realizes that the United States is losing this race disastrously.
Just get smoked.
Yeah. But more critically, he understands the underlying physics of why they are losing. The Soviet Union simply had existing launch vehicles with a significantly higher lift capacity. Their rockets were just massive.
I want to pause on that because it's a fascinating quirk of history. Why did the Soviets have bigger rockets at that exact moment? Was it just better engineering?
No, it was actually an ironic byproduct of their nuclear weapons program. Early Soviet nuclear warheads were incredibly heavy and bulky compared to American designs.
Oh, wow.
So to deliver those massive warheads, they had to build massive intercontinental ballistic missiles. The United States had figured out how to make lighter nuclear weapons, so they built smaller rockets.
That makes sense.
But when the arena suddenly shifted to space exploration, which requires lifting heavy capsules and life support systems out of the atmosphere, the Soviet Union's bulky, overpowered military rockets gave them a massive, immediate advantage.
Wow. So Kennedy looks at the board, realizes he absolutely cannot win the current game with the current rules, and decides to fundamentally change the game.
That's a great way to put it.
It's like realizing you're losing a 100-meter dash because your opponent is simply faster. So you suddenly convince the entire stadium that the race is actually a grueling marathon. You move the finish line so incredibly far out that your current immediate disadvantage is neutralized.
That is a brilliant analogy for Kennedy's strategic pivot.
Yeah.
He needed a challenge that completely exceeded the capabilities of the existing generation of rockets on both sides of the Iron Curtain. He needed a goal so technologically audacious, so incredibly far out of reach, that both the United States and the Soviet Union would effectively have to throw away their current hardware and start from scratch.
And that new, impossibly distant finish line was the moon. In May 1961, Kennedy stands before Congress and makes this breathtaking declaration. He commits the nation to landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth before this decade is out.
Right.
And he doubles down on this immovable deadline the following year, in September 1962, during his famous speech at Rice University in Houston, declaring they choose to go to the moon not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
It remains some of the most potent rhetoric in American political history. But beneath the inspiring delivery, he was establishing a terrifyingly strict deadline. Before this decade is out, he basically started a 10-year countdown clock for a technological leap that relied on metallurgy, computing, and life support disciplines that simply did not exist yet.
We shouldn't assume, however, that the entire country was unified behind this massive expenditure. The source text points out that there was significant vocal opposition to the Apollo program.
Oh, definitely.
Like MIT mathematician Norbert Wiener famously dubbed the proposed program a moondoggle.
The term moondoggle perfectly encapsulates the domestic friction. There was a very real, valid debate regarding resource allocation. Critics argued that funneling billions of dollars into a geopolitical stunt in a vacuum was unconscionable when there were massive social, economic, and civil rights crises unfolding on the ground.
Which is a totally fair point. And I find it fascinating that the tension regarding this massive expenditure was so high that Kennedy actually attempted to diffuse the competitive aspect of the race entirely. Our sources note that in June 1961, Kennedy met with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev and proposed making the moon landing a joint U.S.-Soviet project.
It's one of the great what-ifs of the 20th century.
Yeah.
The ultimate victory of the Cold War could have been a collaborative triumph. Khrushchev, however, declined the offer, likely because he didn't want to reveal the specific technical limitations of the Soviet program to American engineers.
Ah, of course. State secrets.
Exactly. Kennedy even floated the idea again in a 1963 speech to the United Nations, proposing peaceful cooperation in space. But following Kennedy's assassination, the political capital required for a joint mission vanished. The race was locked in, and it was strictly winner-take-all.
When we think about that race today, the popular narrative usually envisions the U.S. slowly but steadily pulling ahead throughout the 1960s. We picture NASA methodically developing the Gemini program, building the Saturn V, and eventually jogging across the finish line alone, while the Soviet program quietly faded into the background.
Right, that's the standard story.
But the source material shatters that narrative. It reveals a hidden climax that is genuinely mind-blowing. This race went right down to the literal wire.
It was a photo finish. As the United States was moving Apollo 11 to the launch pad, the Soviet leadership realized they could not put a human on the moon first. Their equivalent to the Saturn V, the massive N-1 rocket, was plagued by catastrophic failure.
They just couldn't get it to work.
Right. But they refused to concede the narrative victory, so they pivoted their strategy to try and beat the United States to a robotic sample return. Their goal was to land a probe, scoop up lunar soil, and return it to Earth before Armstrong and Aldrin could put the rocks back.
Which is just a spectacularly calculated geopolitical maneuver. It's essentially saying, fine, you spent billions to put a fragile human on the surface, but our superior automated technology brought the moon to us first, without risking a human life.
Exactly. It would have fundamentally altered the historical perception of the achievement. So on July 13th, 1969, a mere 3 days before the Apollo 11 crew launched, the Soviet Union launched a robotic probe called Luna 15.
3 days.
And because Luna 15 didn't have to carry the immense weight of human life support systems, water, and food, it actually reached lunar orbit before Apollo 11 did.
I want you listening to truly visualize this scenario. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins are traversing the void between the Earth and the Moon, carrying the entire psychological weight of American prestige on their shoulders, and there is already a Soviet robot circling their target, actively maneuvering to steal their thunder at the last possible second.
The sheer geopolitical theater of it is just astounding. And this drama played out right up to the final hours. While Armstrong and Aldrin were physically walking on the lunar surface, executing their extravehicular activity, Luna 15 began its automated descent.
Unbelievable.
But calculating a lunar descent from Earth with 1969 computing power was incredibly perilous. Just 2 hours before Armstrong and Aldrin were scheduled to fire their ascent engine to leave the moon, Luna 15 malfunctioned and crashed into Mare Crisium.
2 hours? That is insanely close. I read in the source text that British radio astronomers at the Jodrell Bank Observatory were actually tracking Luna 15 and listening to its transmissions in real time.
They were. The astronomers at Jodrell Bank were recording the telemetry from Luna 15 as it descended, fully aware that they were electronically eavesdropping on the silent, high-stakes climax of a decade-long superpower conflict. They heard the signal abruptly terminate as the probe impacted the surface.
So, to meet this immovable end-of-decade deadline imposed by Kennedy, and to defeat a rival who is literally crashing probes into the moon, trying to beat you by a matter of hours, NASA knew the astronauts couldn't just be exceptionally brave test pilots. Bravery is a prerequisite, but it's not a skill set.
No, not at all.
They had to be subjected to a grueling, completely unprecedented training regimen.
The training requirement was unlike anything in human history because they had to become masters of environments, systems, and procedures that didn't even exist a few years prior.
Right.
The entire Apollo architecture was heavily reliant on the groundwork laid by Project Gemini.
Right. Gemini was the stepping stone.
Gemini was the crucible where NASA figured out the foundational orbital mechanics, like how to rendezvous 2 spacecraft traveling at 17,000 miles per hour, how to dock them, and how a human being could survive working outside a spacecraft in a pressurized suit. But Apollo 11 required an entirely new echelon of preparation.
Let's explore how they simulated the impossible. Because you're attempting to train human beings for an environment no human has ever visited, operating a vehicle that has never been flown in its true configuration. And one of the most fascinating details highlighted in our source material is the critical, often overlooked role of the support crew.
Yes, the support crew concept was an innovation born of necessity. During the earlier Mercury and Gemini projects, the structure was pretty simple. You had a prime crew who flew the actual mission, and a backup crew who trained concurrently, ready to step in if a prime crew member fell ill.
Makes sense.
But for the Apollo program, NASA realized the sheer volume of technical complexity was so overwhelming that they required a third tier. For Apollo 11, the support crew consisted of Ken Mattingly, Ronald Evans, and Bill Pogue.
I want to understand their daily reality. What exactly was the function of a support crew? Because it sounds like they did a lot of the heavy lifting.
Their function was absolutely vital, but almost entirely devoid of the glory. They were the architects of the mission's execution. They were responsible for maintaining the massive flight plan, updating the checklists, and codifying the mission rules. But their most critical contribution was developing the actual procedures, particularly the emergency contingencies.
So they were essentially the beta testers for a lunar landing. They had to figure out how to survive a malfunction before the malfunction even happened.
Precisely. The timeline was so compressed that the prime crew simply didn't have the luxury of time to invent the procedures from scratch.
Yeah.
They only had time to memorize and master them. So Mattingly, Evans, and Pogue would climb into the simulators, figure out the sequential steps to handle, say, a ruptured oxygen tank or a failed navigation unit, run through those steps iteratively to refine them, and then hand a polished, optimized checklist to Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins.
Wow.
And then the prime crew would drill that checklist in the simulators until it became pure muscle memory.
That requires such a bizarre, demanding psychological profile. You have to possess the extreme ego and technical brilliance to write the definitive survival manual for the first lunar landing, but you also need the extreme humility to accept that someone else gets to actually execute it and walk into the history books.
It's a very specific kind of dedication.
And their training wasn't limited to just flying the spacecraft either.
Not at all. The scientific objectives of Apollo 11 were incredibly rigorous. These men were elite test pilots by trade. Their entire careers were built on aerodynamics and flight mechanics. But this mission required them to suddenly become competent field scientists.
Which is a totally different skill set.
Completely. The source text explicitly mentions the involvement of Farouk Elbaz and Gene Shoemaker, who were brilliant geologists. Their task was to take these guest pilots and teach them how to read a lunar landscape, how to differentiate between impact ejecta and bedrock, and how to conduct meaningful field geology under severe time constraints.
And it wasn't just identifying rocks. They were also taking a crash course in contamination control. The text notes that Millicent Goldschmidt, a microbiologist, was brought in to design aseptic lunar material collection techniques.
Yes, the aseptic techniques were crucial.
She had to train the astronauts on how to swab the lunar surface and seal the samples without introducing Earth-based microbes. I want you to imagine being Neil Armstrong in 1969. You're preparing to command the most complex, dangerous test flight in human history. Your life is hanging by a thread. The geopolitical prestige of the free world is resting on your performance, and you're spending your afternoon learning from a microbiologist how to properly handle a sterile swab so you don't contaminate a bag of dirt.
It perfectly illustrates the dual, often conflicting nature of the Apollo program. It was fundamentally a high-stakes experimental test flight, but it was heavily burdened with the expectations of a pristine scientific expedition. They had to execute both roles flawlessly.
But no matter how thoroughly you study the geological formations or how perfectly you memorize the checklists drafted by the support crew, you eventually have to physically operate inside the lunar module. And the physical constraints of that vehicle were absolutely brutal.
How did NASA attempt to simulate that claustrophobia?
The physical reality of the lunar module, the Eagle, was shocking. It was incredibly cramped, essentially the size of a large phone booth for two men.
A phone booth?
Yeah, and the extravehicular mobility units, the spacesuits they wore for the lunar surface operations, were massive, bulky, and highly pressurized. When pressurized, those suits became incredibly rigid. Just bending a joint required significant physical exertion. Maneuvering two men wearing those suits inside that tiny cabin was a logistical nightmare.
There's a specific incident detailed in the text that captures this perfectly. The hatch incident. Yes. They were running a high-fidelity simulation of the egress phase, the actual process of depressurizing the cabin, opening the hatch, and maneuvering out onto the porch to descend the ladder. In this specific simulation, they were testing a protocol where Buzz Aldrin, the lunar module pilot, would exit the spacecraft first.
Which, as we are going to unpack very shortly, was a massive point of interpersonal contention.
Indeed. So Aldrin is in this bulky, fully pressurized suit, attempting to contort his body to maneuver out of this tiny, awkwardly placed hatch in the simulator. The clearances were so impossibly tight, and the suit was so unyielding that Aldrin actually physically damaged the simulator during his attempt to egress.
He literally broke the mock spaceship just trying to squeeze out the front door.
He did. And it wasn't due to clumsiness. It was a stark demonstration of how physically demanding and geometrically precise every single movement had to be. There was absolutely zero margin for error, even in a task as seemingly simple as opening the door and stepping outside.
So let's look at the psychological crucible we've built here. You have three men operating under the crushing geopolitical weight of the Cold War. They're enduring a relentless training regimen that forces them to master test piloting, field geology, and aseptic microbiology simultaneously.
While exhausted.
Yet, they're operating in a claustrophobic simulator that they are physically breaking because the margins are so tight. You would naturally assume that surviving this intense, shared trauma would forge them into absolute best friends, an unbreakable brotherhood.
It's the most natural assumption to make. We're conditioned by movies and literature to believe that extreme shared adversity creates deep emotional bonds. And we see that dynamic in other space flights. Look at the crew of Apollo 12, which flew just months later.
Yeah.
Pete Conrad, Richard Gordon, and Alan Bean.
Oh, they were notorious pranksters.
They were famously intensely close. They drove matching gold Chevrolet Corvettes. They played practical jokes on each other constantly. And they possessed a very boisterous, sibling-like camaraderie.
Right. But for the crew of Apollo 11, here's where it gets really interesting. The men of Apollo 11 were not best friends. In fact, both Aldrin and Collins famously characterized the crew dynamic using a very specific phrase. They called themselves amiable strangers.
Amiable strangers. It's a strikingly cold phrase for three men about to share the greatest adventure in human history. To understand how that dynamic formed, we have to analyze their distinct psychological profiles, which the source material outlines quite revealingly.
Let's break them down.
Sure. Neil Armstrong, the commander, was notoriously aloof. He was an engineer's engineer, incredibly focused, highly competent, but emotionally impenetrable.
He had ice water in his veins, which is exactly what you want when the alarms are blaring, but maybe he isn't the guy you grab a beer with to pour out your deepest insecurities.
Exactly. She didn't invite emotional intimacy. Then you have Michael Collins, the command module pilot. Collins actually considered himself a natural loner. In the text, Collins explicitly confesses that he actively rebuffed Buzz Aldrin's early attempt to forge a more personal, intimate relationship between the crew members.
Wait, I have to stop you there. Collins actively pushed back against team bonding.
He did. Collins preferred a strictly professional boundary. He wanted to focus on the mechanics of his specific role, flying the command module without getting entangled in the emotional dynamics of his crewmates.
Wow.
And then there's Buzz Aldrin, who was brilliant, intensely driven, academically gifted. He had a doctorate from MIT in orbital rendezvous. But he was also known to be highly complex and sometimes quite challenging to work with. His intensity could be abrasive.
And people notice.
Oh, the friction was known well enough that Deke Slayton, the director of flight crew operations, the man solely responsible for crew assignments, actually approached Neil Armstrong with an offer to alter the historic lineup.
This detail completely blew my mind when I read the source text. Slayton actually offered to pull Aldrin off the prime crew of Apollo 11.
He did. Slayton privately gave Armstrong the option to replace Buzz Aldrin with Jim Lovell. The rationale Slayton provided was that several people within the astronaut office and management found Aldrin too difficult to work with, and Slayton wanted to ensure Armstrong had a crew he was entirely comfortable with for a mission of this unprecedented magnitude.
And Armstrong says no. I assume he declined because he felt some deep underlying loyalty to his crewmate Buzz.
Not at all. Armstrong's reasoning was entirely devoid of sentimentality. He thought the offer over for a day, but his decision wasn't based on protecting a deep emotional bond with Aldrin. Armstrong declined because he felt that Jim Lovell, who was highly experienced and had already flown Gemini missions at Apollo 8, deserved to command his own mission, rather than serving as a subordinate lunar module pilot.
And Lovell eventually got that on Apollo 13.
Right. Armstrong concluded that he simply didn't have any professional, operational issues working with Aldrin. And for Armstrong, professional competence was the only metric that mattered.
So they keep the roster intact. You have three guys who respect each other's technical abilities immensely, but they are certainly not sharing secrets at a sleepover. They are coworkers in the purest, most sterile sense of the word.
What's fascinating here is that this detached professionalism might have actually been their greatest asset.
I want to challenge that. You're saying emotional detachment was an asset. If we look at the Apollo 13 crisis, it was the deep intuitive bond between Lavelle, Swigert, and Hayes that helped them interpret each other's stress and survive. Are you certain that being amiable strangers is the optimal model and not just the hand they were dealt?
That's a brilliant counterpoint. The distinction lies in the mission profile. Apollo 13 became an exercise in extreme improvisation and psychological endurance, where interpersonal intuition was vital. But Apollo 11 was fundamentally an exercise in executing a highly rigid, flawlessly timed series of unprecedented mechanical steps.
So there was no room to improvise.
Exactly. In that specific matrix, a single error meant death. The stakes were absolute. If you are deeply emotionally entangled with your crewmates, if you're constantly monitoring their emotional state, or if a technical disagreement feels like a personal betrayal, it introduces cognitive friction. It clouds your judgment.
Oh, I see the distinction. If I'm sitting in the passenger seat and my absolute best friend is driving a car toward a cliff, my emotional connection might cause me to panic, scream, or try to grab the wheel. But if I'm sitting next to a highly trained professional chauffeur who is driving toward a cliff, I might calmly inform him of the obstacle and completely trust his training to execute the evasive maneuver.
Precisely. Emotional detachment allowed for a purely mechanical, uninterrupted professional trust. They didn't need to like each other deeply. They just needed absolute, unshakable faith in each other's operational competence. They relied entirely on the procedures, the telemetry, and the protocols, not on emotional intuition.
But even amiable strangers, operating with machine-like efficiency, aren't immune to the gravitational pull of office politics, especially when the office in question is about to be the surface of the moon. Because underneath this professional veneer, a massive, quiet clash of egos was brewing over one very specific, highly symbolic question.
The question of who would be the first human being to physically set foot on the lunar surface.
The office politics of history. This concept is incredible to me. You're preparing to travel to the moon, which is the most audacious, wildly dangerous thing a human being has ever attempted, and you're still fundamentally arguing over who gets the better parking spot, essentially.
To be fair to the astronauts, it is a bit more historically significant than a parking spot. Whoever takes that first step achieves a level of global immortality that the second person simply does not. Neil Armstrong's name is universally known. Buzz Aldrin's name is known, but it occupies a distinctly different tier in the public consciousness.
That's true.
And Buzz Aldrin fundamentally assumed that he would be the first one out the door.
Why was he so confident in that assumption? Was it purely ego driving that expectation?
No, Aldrin actually possessed a very solid, logically sound argument based entirely on NASA precedent. During the Gemini missions, which laid the operational groundwork for Apollo, there was a strict unwritten protocol regarding spacewalks. The commander of the mission always remained inside the spacecraft, maintaining control of the systems and monitoring the overall flight status. The pilot was always the one who opened the hatch and performed the extravehicular activity.
Because the commander is the ultimate authority. You shouldn't risk the ship's captain floating outside on a tether if something goes catastrophic. He needs to stay at the wheel to mount a rescue or abort.
Exactly. The logic was sound. So, translating that established Gemini protocol to the Apollo architecture, Neil Armstrong is the commander, Buzz Aldrin is the lunar module pilot. Therefore, by Gemini logic, Armstrong stays inside the Eagle, monitoring the ascent engine and life support, while Aldrin steps out onto the moon first. And Aldrin fully expected this progression to hold.
But then the reality of public relations and rumors start swirling through the hallways of NASA.
Yes. In early 1969, reporters covering the space beat, and even some high-level NASA administrators, started hinting internally and externally that Armstrong would likely be the first. And the primary rationale floating around wasn't technical, it was symbolic.
How so?
Armstrong was technically a civilian at that point in his career, whereas Aldrin was active-duty military. In the spirit of a peaceful scientific mission undertaken for all mankind, having a civilian take the first step was viewed by many as symbolically superior to having a military officer plant the flag.
I have to imagine if I'm Aldrin relying on that Gemini precedent, I'm already mentally preparing for that first step. I have to imagine those rumors felt like a massive, deeply personal betrayal of protocol. How did he react?
He was livid. And true to his intense personality, he didn't keep his frustration a secret. Aldrin actively initiated a lobbying campaign within the astronaut office. He basically started working the room, trying to get people on his side. He approached other lunar module pilots who were assigned to future missions and tried to persuade them that he, as the LMP, should be first, arguing that if the commander goes first on Apollo 11, it sets a bad precedent for all future lunar module pilots.
I'm just picturing him in the Houston astronaut cafeteria, sliding his lunch tray over to the other guys, whispering, "Hey, don't you agree the pilot should go first? You need to tell the boss to protect our turf."
That is probably a very accurate visualization. But the source text specifically notes that his peers viewed this intense lobbying campaign cynically. They recognized it as a thinly veiled play for historical immortality, and they did not rally to his defense.
Oh.
The friction grew so intense that eventually, Deke Slayton had to formally step in to stem the conflict before it impacted training. Slayton pulled Aldrin aside and told him flatly that Armstrong would be first, simply because Armstrong was the commander.
End of story. The boss pulls rank, the hierarchy is enforced. But the drama regarding this decision goes so much deeper than just an organizational chart.
It does. For decades after the mission, Aldrin publicly stated that he believed the final decision was largely logistical. He thought it ultimately came down to the physical location of the hatch. Remember that simulator incident we discussed where Aldrin damaged the mock-up trying to egress?
Right, because the pressurized suits were so bulky and rigid.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because of where the hatch hinges were located, how the door swung inward, and how the two men were positioned shoulder to shoulder in the tiny cabin, it was physically much easier for the commander, who stood on the left side, to simply open the hatch, drop to his knees, and back out first.
Makes sense mechanically.
Having the pilot on the right side try to climb completely over the commander in a fully pressurized suit was a logistical nightmare. So Aldrin largely accepted that physical reality as the primary justification.
But the source text reveals that Aldrin's assumption was completely wrong.
He was wrong. The definitive truth was hidden for decades, until Chris Kraft published his autobiography in 2001. Chris Kraft was a legendary flight director and a massive executive force at NASA. In his book, Kraft admitted that a highly secret meeting had taken place between himself, Bob Gilruth, Deke Slayton, and George Low.
You're listing the absolute top brass, the founding fathers of NASA flight operations.
Yes, and Kraft revealed that the specific, explicit purpose of this secret meeting was to ensure that Buzz Aldrin would not be the first man on the moon.
Wait, so it wasn't about the civilian symbolism and it wasn't about the physical geometry of the hatch, it was entirely personal.
It was about personality, ego, and managing the long-term historical perception of the program. These men decided that the first person on the moon needed to possess a very specific psychological demeanor. They wanted someone who was incredibly calm, quiet, and fundamentally unassuming.
The anti-diva.
Exactly. The text notes they specifically used Charles Lindbergh as the historical comparison they were aiming for. They felt Neil Armstrong perfectly embodied that quiet humility. They felt that Aldrin, with his intense ambition, his vocal lobbying, and his complex personality, did not. So this brain trust intentionally dictated the flight plan to explicitly favor Armstrong taking the first step.
I want you listening to really put yourself in Aldrin's shoes for a second. You're going to be the second human being to walk on the surface of another world. That is a completely mind-boggling, awe-inspiring achievement. But you have to spend the entire grueling training period knowing, or at least strongly suspecting, that your bosses held a clandestine meeting specifically to keep you out of the history book's top spot because they fundamentally disliked your personality.
It's a tough pill to swallow.
How does a person compartmentalize that kind of profound professional slight? How do you sit shoulder to shoulder with the guy who got the ultimate prize in a tin can flying toward a rock in a vacuum and not let that resentment kill you both?
That question brings us right back to the concept of amiable strangers and their absolute professional detachment. They had a singular, incredibly dangerous job to do, and the margin for error was literally zero. When the mission parameters demanded it, they possessed the extraordinary psychological discipline to lock away their egos, mute their interpersonal frictions, and operate as a flawless, integrated unit.
And nowhere in the entire history of spaceflight is that flawless unity more apparent than during the actual execution of the lunar landing. This sequence is the ultimate trust exercise.
The powered descent of the lunar module Eagle is arguably one of the most harrowing, complex sequences in aviation history. This is the exact moment where their grueling training, their emotional detachment, and their unbreakable trust in each other's competence played out in real time, under literal life-or-death pressure.
Let's walk through the mechanics of that descent. They separate the Eagle from the command module, leaving Michael Collins in orbit. Armstrong and Aldrin fire the descent engine and begin heading down toward the lunar surface. For the first few minutes, everything is nominal, but then Armstrong realizes a terrifying variable. They're flying way too fast.
Right. Armstrong is looking out his window, visually checking their progress against predetermined craters and landmarks on the surface, and he realizes they're passing those landmarks 2 or 3 seconds earlier than the flight plan dictates.
Which doesn't sound like much, right? 3 seconds.
In orbital mechanics, 3 seconds of extra velocity means they're going to overshoot their intended landing zone by miles. The cause of this overspeed was likely mascons.
We need to explain mascons because it is such a bizarre lunar phenomenon. What are they and how do they alter the flight path?
Mascons is short for mass concentrations. There are areas in the lunar crust where dense, heavy material, likely from ancient asteroid impacts, is concentrated beneath the surface. Because the moon's gravity is already relatively weak, these hidden pockets of dense mass create significant gravitational anomalies.
Like invisible speed bumps or potholes.
Precisely. As the Eagle orbited over these mascons, the localized gravity would literally tug on the spacecraft, subtly altering its velocity and trajectory in ways that were incredibly difficult for the computers back on Earth to perfectly model or predict in 1969.
So the mascons are dragging them off course, they're traveling too fast, they're heading toward an unknown landing site, and then, to make matters worse, the computer starts screaming.
At approximately 6,000 feet above the lunar surface, the lunar module's guidance computer triggers a yellow caution light and displays a 1201 program alarm. Shortly after, it flashes a 1202 alarm.
If you're an astronaut hurtling toward the moon, what does a 1202 alarm actually mean?
It meant the computer was experiencing what they called executive overflows. To understand this, you have to understand the Apollo guidance computer. It was a marvel of engineering, but it had a fraction of the processing power of a modern singing greeting card. It utilized core memory, literally wires woven through tiny magnetic rings. A 1202 alarm meant the computer was being overloaded with data and could not complete all its computational tasks in its required time cycle.
Oh boy.
It was effectively telling the astronauts, I have too much data to process, I am overwhelmed, and I am dropping tasks.
Which is exactly the last thing you want your guidance computer to say when you're trusting it to navigate a controlled fall toward a vacuum-sealed rock.
Naturally, the crew is deeply concerned. If the guidance computer crashes and reboots, they lose their navigation data and they likely crash into the moon. But down in Mission Control in Houston, a 24-year-old computer engineer named Jack Garman instantly recognizes the specific alarm codes. He confidently tells the guidance officer, Steve Bales, that it is safe to continue the descent.
I want to dig into the how-W of this. How on earth is it safe to ignore an overloaded computer that is currently flying your spaceship?
Because the software architecture within that computer was brilliantly, radically designed. The director of Apollo flight computer programming at MIT was a woman named Margaret Hamilton. She and her team had built an incredibly robust system based on asynchronous processing. The software was explicitly designed to recognize when it was becoming computationally overloaded, and instead of crashing, it was programmed to ruthlessly prioritize its functions.
I love comparing this to a triage nurse in an emergency room during a mass casualty event. The nurse doesn't shut down the hospital because there are too many patients. She looks at the crowd and says, ignore the broken arms, focus entirely on the gunshot wounds. Margaret Hamilton essentially programmed the computer to have a triage protocol, a mathematical survival instinct.
That is a perfect analogy. When the 1202 alarm triggered, the computer was actively eliminating low-priority tasks, like updating the digital display for the astronauts, and devoting 100% of its processing power to the critical tasks required to keep the radar functioning and the descent engine firing. Hamilton later stated that if the computer had not been designed to recognize the problem and take this autonomous recovery action, Apollo 11 would almost certainly have had to abort the landing.
But why was it overloaded in the first place? Was it a flaw in Hamilton's code?
No, it was a hardware bug and a procedural error. A switch for the rendezvous radar had been left in the wrong position. This was a deliberate precaution. They wanted to keep the rendezvous radar warmed up and ready in case they had to abruptly abort the landing and quickly find Michael Collins in orbit.
Which makes total sense.
But an electrical mismatch in the analog-to-digital coupling caused the hardware to flood the computer with spurious, meaningless radar data, stealing precious processing cycles and triggering the alarms.
So let's reset the scene. The computer is fighting through a data blizzard, actively triaging its own memory to survive. But because the mascons dragged them off course earlier, the computer's survival instinct is currently guiding them flawlessly toward absolute disaster.
Yes. When Armstrong finally looks out the triangular window to see exactly where the computer is taking them, his blood runs cold. The automated trajectory is flying them directly into a massive boulder-strewn area just north and east of a crater the size of a football stadium, which was later identified as West Crater. The boulders are the size of cars.
And the physical reality of the lunar module dictates that if they land on a boulder, the module tips over. If it tips past a certain angle, the ascent engine cannot fire them back into orbit. They are permanently stranded. They are dead on the moon.
Armstrong recognizes the fatal geometry instantly. He takes semi-automatic control of the Eagle, switching from full computer control to manual attitude control. He decides he has to manually fly the spacecraft over the crater and the boulder field to find a smooth patch of regolith further west. But he is fighting two massive compounding problems. His forward velocity is too high to stop short of the crater, and his fuel is running out incredibly fast.
This is where the teamwork, that amiable strangers dynamic, just absolutely shines. It gives me chills thinking about the mechanics of how they pulled this off.
Armstrong is now entirely focused outside the window. He is manually flying a spacecraft with dynamics unlike any jet he has ever piloted, searching desperately for a flat spot. Because his eyes are locked outside, he cannot look down at the instrument panels to check his altitude or descent rate. He has to rely entirely on his co-pilot.
Buzz Aldrin is staring intently at the computer display, reading out the raw navigation data: altitude, forward speed, descent rate, in a constant, rhythmic, steady stream of numbers. Down 2.5, forward, forward, good.
Aldrin essentially became Armstrong's instruments. He provided the raw, unfiltered data feed that Armstrong's brain required to calculate his manual maneuvers outside. It is an act of pure mechanical trust. If Aldrin misreads a number or lets the tension alter his cadence, they crash. If Armstrong misinterprets the data Aldrin is feeding him, they crash.
And the environment outside the window is rapidly deteriorating. As they drop below 100 feet, the thrust from the descent engine starts violently kicking up decades of fine, undisturbed lunar dust.
Armstrong's visual reference is severely impaired. He is flying in a localized sandstorm. He can no longer clearly see the actual surface to determine how fast they are drifting laterally. He has to pick out large rocks jetting up to the dust cloud and use them as fixed reference points just to gauge their lateral velocity. If they touch down while moving sideways, the fragile landing legs will snap.
And the fuel gauge is practically bouncing on empty.
Mission Control is watching the telemetry. They call out that the Eagle has less than 90 seconds of propellant remaining before a mandatory abort, then 60 seconds, then 30 seconds.
And then, hanging off the bottom of 3 of the lunar module's footpads are these 67-inch long metal probes. They're essentially like the curb feelers on an old Cadillac.
When one of those probes makes physical contact with the lunar surface, a blue indicator light illuminates on the console between the two men. Aldrin sees the light flash and immediately calls out, "Contact light."
Now, according to the strict procedures drafted by the support crew, the moment that light turns on, Armstrong is supposed to immediately slam the engine stop button. Why?
Because the engineers who designed the engine were terrified of blowback. They feared that if the powerful descent engine kept firing while the bell nozzle was practically touching the lunar dirt, the immense pressure from the exhaust reflecting back up off the surface could cause the engine bell to violently rupture or explode, destroying the ascent stage above it.
But Armstrong doesn't press the button.
In the immense, unparalleled tension of those final seconds, focused entirely on flying the vehicle through the dust, he forgets the procedure. He leaves the engine running.
And for 3 terrifying seconds, they are physically touching the moon with a live rocket engine firing directly into the dirt beneath them.
But the engineering holds. The bell does not rupture. 3 seconds later, the Eagle settles completely onto the surface, and Armstrong shuts the engine down. The moment the engine stops, Aldrin doesn't cheer. He immediately starts reading the post-landing checklist. Okay, engine stop, ACA out of detent.
That is pure, unadulterated professionalism. They have just successfully landed a spacecraft on another celestial body with maybe 25 seconds of fuel left in the tanks, making them the first humans to touch an alien world, and their immediate reaction is to coldly read the checklist to ensure the systems are safe.
Armstrong finishes his portion of the immediate checklist, hits his radio transmit button, and makes a completely unrehearsed, unilateral change to their radio call sign. He doesn't say Eagle, he says, "Houston, Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed."
Changing the call sign to Tranquility Base is such an incredible, subtle flex. It instantly tells everyone listening on Earth, we are no longer a vehicle in flight. We are a permanent, grounded installation on a new world.
Down in Houston, Capcom Charles Duke responds with an audible wave of sheer relief. He stammers slightly. Roger, Twan, Tranquility, we copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again.
So what does this all mean when we look back at that amiable strangers dynamic we discussed earlier? What is the ultimate takeaway?
It proves that the romanticized Hollywood idea of a team, the idea that you have to be best friends, that you have to deeply love and understand the people you work with to achieve greatness is a myth. Sometimes the most effective dynamic isn't deep personal affection. It is a deep, unwavering, almost mechanical respect for competence.
You don't need to want to get a beer with your coworker on the weekend. You just need to know with absolute certainty that when the alarms start blaring, the computer is crashing, and the fuel is running out, they are going to read the numbers flawlessly. They trusted each other with their lives, even if they didn't trust each other with their emotional baggage.
It is a profound historical lesson in professional execution. And they desperately needed that cold professionalism because the mission obviously didn't end on the surface. They still had a long, incredibly dangerous journey home, which came with its own bizarre set of challenges and friction points.
Right. They do the historic moonwalk, they plant the flag, they take the phone call from President Nixon, they collect the rocks. Oh, and we have to mention the circuit breaker. Aldrin literally saves the mission with a piece of office equipment.
Yes, it is a testament to the fragility of the environment. While moving around in the tiny, cramped cabin in his bulky suit after the moonwalk, Aldrin accidentally bumped into a panel and physically snapped off a specific circuit breaker switch. And it wasn't just any switch, it was a specific breaker required to arm the ascent engine. Without it, they couldn't fire the engine to leave the moon. They would be stranded.
How do you fix a broken switch on the moon?
With profound ingenuity, Aldrin realized he just needed something to physically push the internal contacts of the breaker together. But it couldn't be metal, or he would electrocute himself and short the system. He solved it by taking a standard Duro felt-tip pen, removing the cap, and jamming the non-conductive plastic tip of the fan into the slot to activate the switch. Again, it is calm, mechanical problem-solving in the face of death.
So the pin trick works. They lift off, they execute the orbital rendezvous with the self-professed loner Michael Collins waiting for them in Columbia, and they fire the engine to head back to Earth. They survive re-entry and splashdown in the Pacific Ocean. But the teamwork and the bizarre claustrophobic working conditions don't end when they hit the water.
Far from it. When their capsule was bobbing in the Pacific, they couldn't just pop the hatch, climb out into the raft, and breathe the fresh ocean air. The scientists at NASA and the CDC were deeply, legitimately concerned about lunar pathogens.
Space germs. It sounds like science fiction now, but they had to treat it as a genuine biological threat.
Exactly. They simply didn't know if the lunar soil harbored microscopic life, dormant viruses or bacteria that could be catastrophically deadly to Earth's biosphere, which had zero immunity to alien pathogens. So before the astronauts could exit the capsule, Navy divers threw 3 biological isolation garments, bigs, into the raft. The astronauts had to open the hatch, pull these heavy, stifling suits inside, put them on, and seal themselves up before they could even be hoisted into the recovery helicopter.
And then they essentially get a chemical bath.
They were heavily scrubbed down with a sodium hypochlorite solution, which is basically industrial bleach, and the exterior of the command module was thoroughly wiped with iodine to kill any potential lunar dust clinging to the hull.
And then the helicopter drops them onto the deck of the aircraft carrier, the USS Hornet.
Where they immediately walk from the helicopter straight into a mobile quarantine facility, or MQF. The MQF was essentially a highly modified, hermetically sealed Airstream travel trailer sitting in the hangar bay of the massive ship.
And how long do these 3 guys have to stay trapped in that trailer?
A total of 21 days, counting from the exact moment they closed the hatch on the lunar module to leave the lunar surface. They stayed locked in the MQF while the aircraft carrier sailed to Hawaii. Then the entire sealed trailer was loaded onto a transport plane and airlifted to Houston, where they finally transferred to a larger quarantine facility called the Lunar Receiving Laboratory.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the psychological irony here is just absolutely staggering.
It really is, if you trace their journey.
You have these 3 specific men. One is a self-professed loner who actively pushed back against team bonding. Another is notoriously aloof and emotionally impenetrable. The third is intensely driven and was privately lobbied against by his peers. They are, by their own admission, amiable strangers. They've just completed the most expansive, mind-expanding, historically profound journey in the history of the human species. They traveled 250,000 miles across the void, and their immediate reward upon returning home as global heroes.
being immediately locked inside a tiny, sealed travel trailer together, breathing the exact same recirculated air, unable to hug their wives or children for 3 entire weeks.
It sounds like a sitcom pitch from hell. Three coworkers who aren't really friends go on a harrowing business trip to the moon, fight over who gets to step out first, almost crash, and then have to live in a camper van together.
It certainly tested the limits of that amiable dynamic one last time. But again, they handled the quarantine with the exact same absolute, detached stoicism that got them to the moon in the first place. They even cheerfully chatted with President Nixon through the small glass window of the trailer.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into our sources, let's summarize the true narrative we've unpacked today. The Apollo 11 mission was absolutely not the smooth, frictionless, universally beloved victory lap that nostalgia and highlight reels often paint it as.
No, it was a deeply complex, fragile endeavor. It was a mission born entirely out of Cold War paranoia and a desperate, politically mandated need to catch up to a superpower rival who was consistently, terrifyingly beating them.
It was fueled by a training regimen that was physically dangerous, forcing test pilots to become scientists, and heavily relying on the unsung, behind-the-scenes labor of support crews, beta testing survival checklists.
And, perhaps most impressively, it was executed by 3 vastly different men who were not close friends. They were amiable strangers who successfully managed immense egos, navigated bitter office politics over who stepped out first, and survived terrifying computer alarms by relying entirely on a foundation of unbreakable, mechanical professional trust.
But before we let you go, there's one final lingering thought we want to leave you with, something that really puts that geopolitical stopwatch and the razor-thin margins of this mission into stark, terrifying perspective.
We mentioned the immense tension of the space race and the very real, ever-present possibility of failure. And the source text reveals that the United States government was acutely, formally prepared for that failure.
William Safire, a speechwriter for President Nixon, had prepared a highly classified memo simply titled, "In Event of Moon Disaster."
It was the text of a speech Nixon was prepared to read to the world if Armstrong and Aldrin were permanently stranded on the lunar surface. If the ascent engine hadn't fired, if Aldrin's felt-tip pen trick hadn't worked, or if the bell had ruptured Machrin, Mission Control's chilling protocol was to literally cut off communication with the lunar module.
They weren't going to let the world listen to them suffocate. They were just going to turn off the radio.
Yes, they would sever the link. And according to the Safire memo, a clergyman would have then conducted a public ritual, commending the astronauts' souls to the deepest of the deep, treating the moon much like a burial at sea.
It is genuinely chilling to think about that speech sitting patiently in a file folder in the Oval Office while Armstrong was dodging boulders. But I want you to pair that grim reality with the other historical footnote we discussed earlier. The Soviet probe, Luna 15.
Right. Luna 15 crashed into Mare Crisium just 2 hours before Armstrong and Aldrin were scheduled to fire that critical ascent engine.
So I want you to think about this alternate timeline. Imagine if the Eagle's engine failed. Armstrong and Aldrin are stranded. Nixon goes on television and reads the Safire memo to a devastated planet. The radio link to the moon goes dead. And meanwhile, on that exact same day, in the exact same news cycle, the Soviet Luna 15 probe lands successfully, automatically scoops up a load of moon rocks, and flawlessly blasts off back to Earth.
It is a profound, paradigm-shifting counterfactual. If the American crewed mission had ended in a highly publicized, agonizing tragedy, while the Soviet robotic mission succeeded perfectly in returning lunar material on the very same day, how would we view the space race today?
Would the history books say that the United States boldly won the space race? Or would the narrative be that the Soviet Union, with their reliable, pragmatic, automated robotics, won the final lap, while the Americans recklessly overreached, prioritized spectacle over science, and paid the ultimate tragic price?
It is a sobering thought, and it brilliantly highlights just how razor-thin the margin truly was between historic, enduring triumph and devastating, humiliating geopolitical defeat.
It really does. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the complex human elements of Apollo 11. We hope the next time you look up at the moon, or even the next time you find yourself deeply frustrated by the friction and personalities in your own workplace, you think about the Eagle. Remember that a perfect team isn't always a group of best friends. Sometimes it's just a group of people who know exactly how to read the dials when the alarms start ringing. We will catch you on the next deep dive.